Hi everyone, Zach here, and welcome to the prep video for lesson 24 in this series on developing a survival game. In this prep video, we'll be talking about some of our texture settings. This video is being moved up from where I originally placed it due to the fact we've started to import textures. We will be importing more textures today, and we'll be importing even more textures in the next section. And because comments from viewers like Bang Bang have pointed out there are some things I didn't cover, and I want to bring that information forward as well so that you're aware. That said, this series has been brought to you by my Patreon sponsors. And with that said, let's move on to this prep video proper. In today's tutorial, we're going to create our equipment pickup actor. So it's basically the thing we've already created. We're just going to give our equipment master some children now. And to do that, we're going to have to create a new enum so we know what part of equipment we're using. So weapon versus a helmet versus body armor. We're going to import item icons, which is why we're going to be talking about some texture sampling stuff. And I'm going to be making a mistake in this video. Bang Bang has pointed out back in video 8. I hope you all go take a look at that comment, by the way. We'll be creating our head-mounted flashlight as well, and some test items just to make sure our equipment system is working properly. All right, so that said, let's move on to texture sampling. Settings, texture settings. So textures can be compressed in different ways based on the needs for your project. There is no one-size-fits-all best approach. It should be the compression settings based on your needs. So if you remember back in section 1 when we imported the UI assets, we changed some of their texture settings. We didn't change enough of them. We should have changed one of them, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But if you remember, for example, one of them, our hunger bar, was converted over to a normal, and that is a compression setting that we can use. We'll talk a bit more about this in a moment. Just want you to be aware that we've looked at this sort of stuff before. So, sometimes when we are doing certain things, we have certain masks we don't need the sRGB elements of the mask. Sometimes we don't need the alpha channel. So depending on what we need it to do, will determine how we want to compress it. And fortunately, Epic has made a bunch of sort of default settings for imports that make it a little bit easier to work with, or compressions. And as I mentioned, sometimes it's more efficient to use other approaches than the default settings. So things like, do you need the alpha channel? Well, hey, if not, you can actually select a thing that says compress without alpha. There's also a compression setting where some of them don't include the alpha. Sometimes you'll need to use both of them in tandem. It's like the default setting can actually include or not include the alpha channel. There's a checkbox above it that says compress without alpha. That's when you would use that particular checkbox. We also, as I've mentioned, have texture compression. So the default, which is DTX1/5, BC1/3, and DX11. Now, DXT1 does not use an alpha channel. So if you didn't need the alpha channel, you want to use default setting, that's when you click the checkbox I just mentioned. But DXT5 does support the alpha channel. So you have both of those settings in there, and you can tweak it based on your needs. We have a normal map setting, which is the one I was talking about when we imported our hunger bar. So the most efficient way to compress a normal map is to use the texture compression setting of normal map. It's optimized for it. As I mentioned, masks. So that has no sRGB. So it is a DXC1 or 5 that disables the sRGB because masks don't need to be gamma corrected. And again, it's, as the name says, it's optimized for mask textures. Then we have ones like user interface 2G RGBA. This is the one that we should have been using in section 1. We'll actually come back to this again in section 6. So this is what Bang Bang was talking about in his comment. And it's the most efficient setup for textures used in the UI. So the textures we import today, even though I don't do it in the video, you might want to set them to that, as well as the old textures. Just as a heads up. Then we have some other texture settings which you should be aware of, because again, this is going to come up in section 5. We have the maximum texture size. Now, a default texture that we use, the maximum will be 0. That is, 0 means use the maximum, the format possible for the target system we are rendering to. Except for when you are working with cube maps or HDR longitude latitude cube maps. We'll see this, as I mentioned, in section 5 when we create our nighttime setting. The default size here is 512, so 512 by 512. Actually, I don't think it's 512. I think it's 512 by 1080. Oddly, you can double check we can double check my memory on that when we get to section 5. But the default setting you'll see is 512. And we get to maps, think about why that number exists. Why is it that number? We'll talk about that in section 4, by the way. So these are just reminders of why we're bringing these numbers up now. They do play a role down the road. So while we typically won't change our maximum texture size when we're working with cube maps, hint, hint, we will change our default settings there. All right, and then we have compression quality, which, let's be really simple about this. It does what it says on the tin. There's a low, medium, high, epic. There's a drop-down thing. That one should just be kind of obvious. It changes the quality of the image when it's compressed. The other thing I want to bring up today, really briefly, is importing assets. And there's a few ways which we can do this. And what you've seen so far in this series is us dragging and dropping from the asset pack, which again, remember, is located down in the description below. It's what we've done throughout the series. It just automatically uses the default settings and tries to guess at any special settings. We saw that with the normal map on the hunger bar. And it lists the source file as where the file was originally stored. In today's video, I'll actually directly show that. Now, the other thing we can do is save the raw asset in the content folder itself in Windows Explorer or whatever OS you're running from. And it's an alternative way to import assets. The editor will ask you if you want to import the asset, yes or no. And it will list the file source as a version stored in the content folder. So that's sort of the things to know about it. There are some other differences as well, but the documentation is a bit sparse. And then we also have migrating assets, which we'll talk about in section 4. All right, that said, I know this has been a bit of a different prep video. It doesn't really cover what we're doing, but hopefully you've learned some stuff about the texture settings, be it compression, be it the different modes we have, or what have you. And if you've enjoyed this series, make sure to hit the like button down below. It really does help this channel out. And if you want to be here for our next tutorial, make sure to hit the subscribe and then click the notify bell so you know when that tutorial is out. This video has been brought to you by Patreon sponsors like Hanas, Quad Menson, and Rian. And all of that said, I look forward to seeing you in today's tutorial and in next week's prep video. And I hope that you have a wonderful day.